Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The stagecoach wheels kicked up a cloud of dust that hung in the Arizona heat, like a curtain between dreams and reality as Étienne Rousseau stood on the porch of his isolated ranch, clutching the faded photograph that had arrived 6 months earlier, with a letter promising him a bride who would transform his lonely existence into something worth living for in this God-forsaken territory where decent women were rarer than silver strikes and twice as precious. The woman who stepped down from the coach was even more beautiful than her picture had suggested, with raven black hair that caught the desert sun like silk and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than the canyon that carved through his property like a wound in the earth. Céleste Dubois moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who had supposedly spent her life in the civilized drawing rooms of New Orleans, her expensive traveling dress somehow managing to look fresh, despite the 3-day journey through dust and heat that had left the other passengers looking like they'd been dragged behind the coach rather than riding inside it. Her smile was warm and genuine as she accepted his nervous greeting, but there was something in her eyes, a sharpness that reminded him of the way cougars looked at prey just before they struck, that made his stomach flutter with unease, even as his heart soared with the hope that his lonely days were finally over. The luggage that the driver unloaded from the coach was surprisingly light for someone who was supposedly moving permanently to frontier territory, consisting of only 2 small trunks and a leather satchel that she kept close to her body with the kind of protective instinct that suggested it contained something far more valuable than ladies' jewelry or personal mementos. When Étienne reached to help carry her bags, she politely but firmly insisted on handling the satchel herself, her fingers wrapping around the handle with practiced ease that spoke of familiarity with keeping important things secure during travel through dangerous country where bandits and Apache raiders made every journey a gamble with death. The conversation during their ride to the ranch was pleasant, but strangely formal, as if she were playing a role she had rehearsed but wasn't entirely comfortable with. While her questions about his property and the surrounding territory seemed oddly specific for someone whose interests should have been focused on domestic matters like gardening and homemaking, rather than details about escape routes and defensive positions that wouldn't occur to most ladies unless they had experience with situations where such knowledge meant the difference between survival and capture. Her laughter was musical and appropriate, but it never quite reached her eyes, which continued to scan the landscape with the kind of systematic alertness that reminded him uncomfortably of the way soldiers watched for enemy movement during Indian campaigns. When they arrived at his ranch and she stepped down from the wagon with movements that were just a little too controlled and balanced for someone whose experience was limited to drawing rooms and church socials, Étienne began to suspect that his mail-order bride might not be exactly what she appeared to be, while the way her hand briefly touched the concealed outline of something beneath her traveling cloak made him wonder what kind of woman would come armed to meet her future husband, and whether his desperate loneliness had led him to invite danger into his home in the form of someone whose true identity and purpose might be far different from the gentle, refined lady he thought he had been corresponding with for the past 6 months. 6 months earlier, the advertisement that had appeared in the New Orleans Times-Picayune was exactly what Étienne had been hoping to find during his weekly trips to town for supplies and mail, offering him the possibility of correspondence with refined ladies who were seeking marriage to respectable gentlemen in Western territories, where opportunities for feminine advancement were limited, but where a woman's civilizing influence could transform rough frontier existence into something approaching the cultured life that proper breeding and education were supposed to provide. The loneliness that had been eating at his soul like acid ever since his arrival in Arizona had become unbearable during the long winter months, when storms made travel impossible and the silence of his empty house seemed to mock his dreams of family and companionship that frontier isolation was systematically destroying. The first letter that arrived in response to his carefully composed introduction was written in elegant script that spoke of education and refinement. While the content revealed a woman whose intelligence and wit exceeded anything he had dared hope for, in a territory where most available females were either saloon girls whose pasts made them unsuitable for respectable marriage, or farmers' daughters whose limited education and narrow experience made conversation about anything beyond livestock and weather impossible. Celeste's letters revealed knowledge of literature and current events that suggested sophisticated upbringing, while her questions about his ranch and territorial life demonstrated genuine interest in frontier existence that went beyond romantic fantasies about Western adventure into practical considerations about climate, dangers, and isolation that realistic preparation for frontier marriage required. The correspondence that developed over the following months created emotional intimacy that exceeded anything Étienne had experienced through direct contact with women. While the gradual revelation of her background through carefully phrased letters painted picture of Southern lady whose family had lost everything during the war and whose reduced circumstances made marriage to Western rancher seem like salvation rather than sacrifice. Her descriptions of New Orleans society and cultural refinements made him ashamed of his rough frontier manners, while also inspiring him to improve his property and appearance in preparation for welcoming someone whose standards exceeded anything his isolated existence had required him to maintain. The photograph that arrived with her acceptance of his marriage proposal showed face that exceeded his most optimistic dreams about what mail-order correspondence might provide, while her letter explaining her eagerness to begin new life in Arizona territory suggested romantic idealism about frontier marriage that his own desperation for companionship had encouraged despite practical concerns about whether refined Southern lady could adapt to harsh realities of territorial existence where survival often depended on capabilities that drawing room education didn't provide. The money that he sent for traveling expenses represented significant portion of his savings, but the prospect of ending his isolation made any financial sacrifice seem worthwhile. The arrangements that were made for her journey included detailed instructions about stagecoach schedules and connections that she had requested with thoroughness that seemed excessive for someone whose travel experience should have been limited to supervised trips between respectable households. While her insistence on traveling alone despite his offer to escort her from the nearest railroad terminus suggested independence that contradicted the helpless femininity that her letters had implied would make her grateful for masculine protection and guidance that frontier marriage was supposed to provide to women whose delicate natures required constant care and supervision. The evening meal that Celeste prepared in his kitchen demonstrated culinary skills that exceeded anything her letters had suggested about domestic accomplishments. While her familiarity with frontier ingredients and cooking methods seemed inconsistent with New Orleans' upbringing that should have provided experience only with refined cuisine, that domestic servants typically prepared for ladies whose education focused on ornamental rather than practical skills. The efficiency with which she organized his primitive kitchen and the casual way she handled knives that were designed for butchering rather than delicate food preparation suggested hands-on experience with frontier living that contradicted everything she had told him about her sheltered Southern background. The conversation during dinner revealed knowledge of territorial politics and current events that went far beyond what newspapers could provide to someone whose interest was purely academic, while her questions about local law enforcement and territorial administration demonstrated understanding of jurisdictional complications and legal procedures that seemed oddly sophisticated for someone whose concerns should have been focused on domestic arrangements and social opportunities that marriage to established rancher might provide. when she asked about the location of the nearest federal marshal's office and territorial courthouse. Her explanation that such information was necessary for marriage license arrangements didn't quite explain the strategic precision of her inquiries. The tour of his property that he provided after dinner revealed her ability to assess defensive positions and escape routes with expertise that exceeded casual observation, while her comments about sight lines and tactical advantages were disguised as admiration for scenic views, but demonstrated military-style thinking that refined ladies weren't supposed to possess unless they had personal experience with situations where such knowledge was essential for survival. The way she automatically positioned herself to maintain clear views of approaches to the house while appearing to admire the sunset suggested training in situational awareness that drawing room education definitely didn't include in curriculum for proper feminine development. The bedtime arrangements that he had prepared with careful attention to her presumed modesty were accepted with gratitude that seemed genuine. But her insistence on keeping her personal belongings in her room rather than allowing him to store them safely in his study suggested protective instincts about possessions that might contain items requiring immediate access rather than sentimental objects that normal storage would adequately protect. The way she tested the locks on windows and doors while pretending to ensure proper closure for nighttime security revealed familiarity with defensive preparations that contradicted everything about the helpless femininity that her correspondence had implied would make her dependent on masculine protection. When she retired to her room for the night, the sounds that carried through thin walls suggested activities that seemed inconsistent with normal bedtime preparations, including metallic clicks that could have been jewelry being arranged, but which sounded suspiciously like weapons being checked and cleaned with practiced efficiency that would be necessary for someone whose survival depended on maintaining equipment in perfect working condition. The soft footsteps that moved around her room throughout the night revealed sleeplessness that could have been excitement about impending marriage, but which followed patterns of surveillance and security checks that suggested experience with hostile environments where relaxed vigilance could result in sudden death from enemies whose approach might be detected only through systematic monitoring of sounds and movements that indicated potential threats. The morning routine that Céleste established included pre-dawn activities that she explained as prayers and meditation suitable for devout Catholic lady, but the sounds that preceded sunrise suggested physical exercises that were more consistent with military training than religious devotion, while glimpses through partially open curtains revealed movements that looked like weapons practice disguised as morning calisthenics. When Étienne commented on her early rising habits, her explanation about plantation discipline and religious obligations seemed plausible, but didn't quite account for the systematic precision of activities that suggested regular training regimen rather than casual spiritual practice. The breakfast that she prepared demonstrated continued competence with frontier cooking, while also revealing knowledge of nutrition and meal planning that exceeded normal domestic education, particularly her understanding of dietary requirements for sustained physical activity and high-stress situations that suggested familiarity with conditions where proper nutrition could mean the difference between survival and collapse during extended periods of dangerous work. Her questions about his normal eating habits and food storage capabilities seemed focused on practical concerns that went beyond simple housekeeping into territory involving preparation for situations that might require extended self-sufficiency. The laundry that she undertook despite his protests about such work being beneath someone of her supposed refinement revealed clothing items that didn't quite match the refined Southern lady image that her correspondence had created, including undergarments designed for freedom of movement rather than fashionable silhouette and fabric choices that prioritized durability over appearance in ways that suggested experience with activities that were harder on clothing than drawing room socializing or domestic supervision typically required. The way she handled and cleaned these items suggested familiarity with maintaining equipment, rather than simply caring for delicate feminine apparel. The accident that occurred when she was hanging laundry revealed reflexes that contradicted everything about helpless femininity, as her instant response to the attacking rattlesnake involved movements that were faster and more precise than anything civilian experience typically provided, while her method of killing the snake demonstrated knowledge of anatomy and technique that could only have been acquired through training or extensive practice, with situations where split-second reaction time meant the difference between life and death. The casual way she disposed of the snake's body and continued with her work suggested that such incidents were routine rather than traumatic experiences for someone whose background had supposedly been sheltered from frontier dangers. The explanation that she provided for her quick reflexes involved childhood experiences with snakes on family plantation, but the specific techniques she had used were more consistent with military or law enforcement training than casual familiarity with agricultural hazards. While her knowledge of snake behavior and anatomy exceeded what general experience would provide without specialized education or professional necessity for understanding dangerous wildlife. When Étienne praised her courage and skill, her dismissive response suggested modesty, but also revealed discomfort with attention to capabilities that she was clearly trying to conceal behind facade of conventional feminine helplessness that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain under scrutiny of daily life together. The visit to town that Céleste requested for purchasing supplies provided opportunities for observation that confirmed Étienne's growing suspicions about his bride's true identity, as her behavior in the general store demonstrated familiarity with frontier commerce and territorial currency that exceeded what recent arrival from New Orleans should have possessed. While her interactions with local residents revealed knowledge of names and relationships that couldn't have been acquired through their brief correspondence or casual conversation during her arrival. The way people looked at her suggested recognition that went beyond normal curiosity about new arrivals, while several conversations were cut short when she approached in ways that seemed designed to prevent her from overhearing discussions that her presence made uncomfortable. The shopping that she conducted focused on items that seemed inconsistent with domestic needs, including purchases of ammunition and supplies that would be necessary for extended travel through dangerous country rather than establishing comfortable household in settled ranch environment, while her questions about territorial law enforcement and federal jurisdiction were disguised as general curiosity, but demonstrated understanding of legal complications that suggested personal experience with situations where such knowledge was essential for avoiding prosecution or capture. The money that she used for purchases came from sources that she couldn't adequately explain, despite his indirect inquiries about her financial arrangements. The saloon that they passed during their town visit created reaction from Céleste that revealed recognition and tension that couldn't be explained by normal feminine distaste for drinking establishments, while the way she automatically positioned herself to avoid being seen by occupants suggested familiarity with specific individuals whose presence threatened her cover story rather than general modesty about exposure to rough frontier behavior. When several men emerged from the saloon and began following them at distance, her immediate awareness of surveillance and systematic countermeasures demonstrated training in evasion techniques that refined ladies definitely weren't supposed to possess. The confrontation that developed when the followers attempted to approach them was resolved through Céleste's intervention before Étienne could respond to potential threat, while her method of discouraging unwanted attention involved verbal warnings and body language that communicated dangerous competence more effectively than physical violence would have achieved. The specific phrases she used and the way she carried herself during this interaction suggested familiarity with criminal elements and ability to communicate in language that frontier outlaws respected and understood without requiring demonstration of capabilities that maintaining her cover required her to conceal. The return journey to the ranch was conducted with security precautions that Céleste implemented without explanation, including route changes and observation techniques that ensured they weren't being followed, while her casual conversation about domestic topics couldn't quite disguise systematic surveillance activities that revealed professional training in counterintelligence and evasion procedures that civilian experience definitely didn't provide. When Étienne commented on her apparent nervousness, her explanation about general frontier dangers seemed reasonable, but didn't account for specific expertise she had demonstrated during situations that had required immediate tactical decisions rather than simple caution about potential threats. The weekly mail delivery that arrived during their second week together included territorial newspapers and official notices that Étienne normally ignored, but Céleste's reaction to the federal marshal's bulletin board updates suggested recognition and concern that couldn't be explained by casual interest in territorial law enforcement activities. When she volunteered to sort through mail and official notices while he tended livestock, her eagerness to handle correspondence seemed helpful, but also provided opportunities for private examination of documents that might contain information relevant to her true identity and purpose in choosing his remote ranch as refuge from whatever circumstances had forced her into deception. The wanted poster that was included in territorial marshal communications bore photograph and description that matched Céleste's appearance closely enough to confirm Étienne's growing suspicions about his bride's real identity, while the charges listed included bounty hunting activities and questionable methods that had resulted in federal investigation of her operations throughout 3 territories where her success rate and willingness to pursue dangerous criminals had created reputation that exceeded anything normal law enforcement typically achieved. The reward offered for information leading to her capture indicated that federal authorities considered her activities sufficiently problematic to justify significant expenditure for ending her career through prosecution or elimination. The information contained in official documentation revealed that Céleste Dubois was actually Victoire Beauregard, whose reputation as territorial bounty hunter exceeded anything that legitimate law enforcement had accomplished in regions where federal authority was limited and territorial jurisdiction was complicated by jurisdictional disputes and political corruption that made conventional prosecution impossible for criminals whose resources exceeded normal territorial capabilities. Her methods included techniques that challenged legal boundaries while achieving results that territorial peace and federal authority required for maintaining civilized governance in regions where organized crime was threatening constitutional government and citizen safety. The criminal organization that she had been pursuing when she disappeared from territorial law enforcement records included individuals whose capture had been essential for eliminating systematic violence and corruption that threatened territorial development and federal authority. While her decision to cease bounty hunting activities and assume false identity suggested either retirement from dangerous profession or strategic withdrawal from public visibility for purposes that federal investigation couldn't determine without additional intelligence about her current location and activities. The timing of her disappearance coincided with completion of several high-profile captures that had eliminated major threats to territorial security. The decision that Étienne faced involved choosing between reporting his discovery to federal authorities who were seeking information about her whereabouts and protecting someone whose deception had been motivated by circumstances that he couldn't fully understand, but which had brought unexpected happiness and companionship to his isolated existence. While recognition that she had chosen his ranch as refuge suggested that her feelings for him might be genuine despite false identity, that necessity rather than malicious intent had created for purposes that might justify continued protection rather than betrayal to federal investigation that could result in her capture and prosecution. The confrontation that Étienne initiated about his discovery was conducted with careful attention to avoiding accusations that might prompt flight response. While his direct questions about her true identity and purpose in seeking marriage through false pretenses created emotional crisis that tested whether their developing relationship could survive revelation of deception that had been fundamental to everything they had built together during their brief time as husband and wife. Celeste's initial attempt to maintain her cover story collapsed when presented with evidence that made denial impossible, while her transition from pretense to honesty revealed emotional vulnerability that contradicted the professional competence that her reputation as bounty hunter had been built upon. The explanation that she provided about her background included childhood experiences with violence and loss that had created motivation for pursuing criminal justice through methods that conventional law enforcement couldn't achieve, while her entry into bounty hunting had been motivated by personal tragedy rather than simple desire for financial gain or excitement that normally attracted people to dangerous professions that required willingness to risk death for uncertain rewards. The family members who had been murdered by criminal organization had included parents and siblings whose deaths had never been addressed through territorial law enforcement that was either incompetent or corrupted by political influence that protected criminals from consequences that justice required. The career that had developed from personal vendetta into professional reputation was described through accounts of specific cases that revealed both competence and moral commitment that exceeded simple law enforcement into territory involving personal justice for victims whose suffering had been ignored by official authorities, whose effectiveness was limited by jurisdictional complications and political considerations that prevented adequate response to systematic criminal activity. Her methods included techniques that challenged legal boundaries, but which had achieved results that territorial peace and federal authority required for protecting civilian populations against organized crime that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. The retirement from bounty hunting that had led to correspondence with Étienne was motivated by recognition that pursuing criminals had created enemies whose patience with her interference was exhausted, while continued operations would require constant vigilance and mobility that made normal life impossible for someone whose emotional needs included security and companionship. That dangerous profession couldn't provide without risking everything that made life worth living, rather than simply surviving from one capture to the next. The decision to seek marriage had been a genuine attempt to build different kind of future that could provide meaning beyond professional accomplishment and personal revenge that had consumed years of her life. The feelings that had developed during their correspondence and brief marriage were admitted to be genuine despite deceptive foundation, while her recognition that maintaining false identity was unsustainable created emotional conflict between desire for honest relationship and practical necessity of avoiding federal investigation that her capture could trigger for both of them if their marriage was discovered to be part of harboring fugitive whose wanted status made any assistance a federal crime, regardless of motivation or personal feelings that had developed between people whose relationship had begun through deception, but which had evolved into something worth protecting despite legal complications and potential consequences. The dust cloud that appeared on the eastern horizon during their third week together carried threats that Celeste recognized immediately despite distance that made identification impossible for normal observation. While her instant transition from domestic tranquility to professional alertness revealed training and experience that domestic life couldn't entirely suppress, when survival instincts detected dangers that civilian alertness would miss until too late for effective response. The systematic way she began implementing security measures while maintaining appearance of normal household activities demonstrated capability for functioning under pressure while concealing defensive preparations from enemies whose approach required immediate tactical response. The gang that was approaching their ranch included criminals whose escape from federal custody had been accomplished through methods that exceeded normal criminal capabilities, while their pursuit of Celeste was motivated by revenge rather than simple desire to eliminate law enforcement threat. as her previous captures of their associates had included systematic disruption of criminal operations that had cost them profits and territory worth more than money could measure in regions where criminal control provided advantages that legitimate competition couldn't challenge through normal business methods. Their numbers and equipment suggested preparation for siege warfare rather than simple assassination attempt. The defenses that Céleste implemented included positioning of weapons and ammunition that revealed systematic planning for extended combat. While her knowledge of ranch layout and tactical advantages demonstrated professional assessment that had been conducted during apparently casual daily activities that concealed strategic evaluation of defensive possibilities and escape routes that might be necessary for survival against opponents whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal threats through organization and resources, that suggested backing from sources whose identity and motivation extended beyond personal revenge into territory involving systematic elimination of law enforcement obstacles. The explanation that she provided to Étienne about approaching danger included enough truth to ensure his cooperation while concealing details that might create additional risks for someone whose civilian experience hadn't prepared him for combat situations where tactical knowledge and split-second decisions meant difference between survival and death at hands of enemies whose methods included torture and systematic elimination of witnesses whose testimony could compromise operations that exceeded normal criminal activity into territory involving political conspiracy and systematic corruption of territorial governance through violence and intimidation. The choice that confronted them involved fight or flight options that would determine not only their immediate survival, but also future possibilities for relationship that had become more important to both of them than individual safety. While recognition that their ranch's isolation provided both defensive advantages and strategic disadvantages created tactical problems that would require combining Céleste's professional experience with Étienne's knowledge of local geography and resources for achieving outcome that could eliminate threats while preserving possibilities for continued life together, despite circumstances that were forcing confrontation with enemies whose patience with interference had been exhausted through systematic losses that her professional success had inflicted on criminal operations. The weapons cache that Céleste revealed from concealment in her luggage exceeded anything frontier household would normally require for protection against conventional threats. While the variety and sophistication of armaments demonstrated professional preparation for combat situations that civilian experience couldn't anticipate or address through normal defensive measures that territorial isolation typically required for protection against random criminal activity or Indian raids. Her familiarity with each weapon and systematic approach to ammunition distribution revealed training that had been gained through extensive experience with life-and-death situations, where equipment failure or tactical error meant immediate elimination by enemies whose competence exceeded anything civilian resistance could match. The tactical assessment that she conducted of their defensive situation included systematic evaluation of approaches, cover positions, and escape routes that demonstrated military-style thinking about combat operations, while her explanation of enemy capabilities and likely attack methods revealed intelligence about criminal organization that exceeded normal law enforcement knowledge through personal experience with opponents whose methods and resources she understood from previous encounters that had established her reputation as someone whose capabilities exceeded conventional bounty hunting into territory, requiring specialized training and exceptional competence for survival against professional criminals whose own skills had been proven in territorial warfare. The fortification that they implemented during daylight hours before expected attack included modifications to ranch buildings that maximized defensive advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities that attacking force could exploit. While improvised obstacles and defensive positions demonstrated Celeste's understanding of siege warfare and urban combat that civilian education definitely didn't provide without military training or extensive practical experience with situations where survival depended on superior tactics and systematic preparation rather than luck or simple courage that might be adequate against normal threats but which would be inadequate against organized assault by professional criminals. The psychological preparation that Céleste provided for Étienne included honest assessment of dangers they would face, while also building confidence that their defensive advantages and superior position could enable survival against numerically superior enemies whose attack would be disadvantaged by unfamiliar terrain and defensive preparations that had been designed specifically for defeating conventional assault methods that criminal organizations typically employed for eliminating obstacles to profitable operations. Her teaching included basic combat techniques and tactical coordination that could multiply their effectiveness through cooperation and mutual support during engagement. The waiting that preceded attack created emotional intimacy that exceeded anything normal courtship could have provided, while shared danger and mutual dependence created bonds that transcended deception and false identity through recognition that their feelings for each other had become more important than individual survival or professional obligations that had brought them together under circumstances that were forcing them to choose between personal happiness and practical considerations about legal status and federal investigation that their relationship might trigger if they survived immediate threats to focus on future possibilities that honest marriage might provide. The attack that commenced at dawn was conducted with precision that confirmed Celeste's assessment of enemy capabilities, while coordinated assault from multiple directions demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded normal criminal operations through systematic approach to siege warfare that suggested military training or professional consultation for eliminating defensive advantages that amateur resistance might provide against organized force, whose resources included specialized equipment and experienced personnel, whose competence had been proven through previous successful operations against law enforcement targets whose elimination had required superior planning and execution. The initial exchange of gunfire revealed that defending forces were outnumbered but not outmatched in terms of tactical position and defensive preparation, while Céleste's professional competence and Étienne's knowledge of local terrain created defensive capabilities that exceeded what attacking force had anticipated, despite their preparation and intelligence about ranch layout that had been gathered through surveillance operations that had preceded direct assault. The accuracy and systematic approach of defensive fire demonstrated that random criminal violence was being countered by professional law enforcement techniques that could achieve tactical superiority despite numerical disadvantages. The siege tactics that attacking force implemented included attempts to destroy water supplies and eliminate escape routes while maintaining pressure that was designed to force surrender or tactical errors that would provide opportunities for direct assault that could overwhelm defensive positions through concentrated attack at vulnerable points that systematic observation had identified as weaknesses in fortified position. Their patience and coordination suggested resources that could sustain extended operations until defensive ammunition and supplies were exhausted through prolonged engagement that favored numerically superior force. The defensive response that Céleste coordinated included counter-sniper operations and systematic harassment that prevented attacking force from achieving secure positions for sustained bombardment, while her tactical innovations utilized ranch infrastructure and natural features for creating crossfire zones and defensive obstacles that multiplied effectiveness of limited personnel and ammunition through superior positioning and coordinated fire that made direct assault prohibitively costly for enemies whose numerical superiority was being negated by defensive advantages that professional preparation had created through systematic exploitation of tactical opportunities. The psychological warfare that accompanied physical combat included threats and demands that revealed criminal motivation for assault, while also demonstrating that surrender would not ensure survival for defending forces whose elimination was necessary for preventing future interference with criminal operations that exceeded simple revenge into territory, involving systematic elimination of law enforcement obstacles whose testimony or continued operations could threaten profitable activities that criminal organization was protecting through violence that exceeded normal territorial lawlessness into organized assault on constitutional authority and territorial governance. The breakthrough that changed tactical situation came when Celeste's systematic observation revealed weakness in attacking forces coordination that could be exploited through targeted elimination of leadership element, whose tactical control was essential for maintaining organized assault against defensive positions that had proven more effective than criminal intelligence had anticipated, despite extensive surveillance and preparation that had preceded direct attack. Her identification of command structure and communication methods provided opportunities for disrupting enemy operations through precision strikes that could create confusion and tactical disadvantage that numerical superiority couldn't overcome without coordination. The counterattack that she launched during temporary lull in enemy fire was conducted with professional precision that demonstrated capabilities exceeding anything normal civilian defense could achieve, while her systematic approach to eliminating specific targets created cascading effects that disrupted criminal coordination and created tactical chaos that defensive forces could exploit through aggressive response that transformed siege situation into conventional combat, where training and preparation provided advantages that could overcome numerical disparities through superior tactics and systematic exploitation of enemy weaknesses that confusion had created. The support that Étienne provided during offensive operations exceeded anything his civilian background had prepared him for. But desperation and determination created motivation that enabled learning tactical skills through immediate application under conditions where mistakes meant death, while success meant survival for both of them and possibility for future together, that mutual dependence and shared danger had made more precious than individual safety or personal concerns about legal consequences that their relationship might create if federal investigation discovered his assistance in protecting wanted fugitive whose capture was priority for territorial law enforcement. The collapse of criminal assault was accomplished through systematic elimination of key personnel and tactical positions that had been essential for maintaining coordinated attack. While surviving attackers' retreat was accomplished under pressure from defensive fire that demonstrated professional competence and territorial knowledge that exceeded anything they had anticipated, despite intelligence preparation that had been designed to ensure successful elimination of targets whose interference with criminal operations could no longer be tolerated through normal intimidation or legal manipulation that corruption had previously provided for protecting profitable illegal activities from law enforcement intervention. The victory that was achieved through defensive success created immediate relief while also establishing recognition that their survival had been accomplished through combination of professional competence and mutual cooperation that had transcended individual capabilities through shared commitment to protecting relationship that had become more important than personal safety or legal considerations that federal investigation might create for both of them if their marriage and cooperation in eliminating criminal threats became subject to official scrutiny that could result in prosecution, despite circumstances that had justified extraordinary measures for survival against systematic criminal violence. The cleanup that followed successful defense revealed scope of criminal operation that had been targeting their ranch, while examination of equipment and documentation that attacking force had carried provided evidence of systematic planning that exceeded simple revenge into territory involving elimination of law enforcement obstacles whose testimony or continued operations could threaten criminal activities throughout territorial regions, where federal authority was limited and local law enforcement was compromised by corruption or incompetence that made systematic criminal operations possible through intimidation and violence rather than legitimate business competition. The federal marshal who arrived in response to reports of sustained gunfire brought additional complications that tested whether their successful defense would result in recognition and protection or prosecution and separation despite circumstances that had justified extraordinary measures for survival against organized criminal assault. While his investigation of crime scene and testimony from survivors created opportunities for official recognition of Celeste's contribution to territorial law enforcement, while also requiring explanation of circumstances that had brought wanted bounty hunter into marriage with civilian rancher whose cooperation had been essential for successful defensive operations. The immunity agreement that was negotiated through federal consultation recognized that Celeste's previous operations had served territorial law enforcement despite methods that had challenged legal boundaries, while her cooperation in eliminating criminal organization that had been threatening territorial security created foundation for official recognition and legal protection that could enable continued residence in territory without fear of prosecution for past activities that had been motivated by circumstances that conventional law enforcement had been unable to address through normal procedures that democratic governance typically required for maintaining constitutional authority and citizen protection. The marriage that was officially recognized through federal documentation provided legal foundation for their relationship while also establishing Celeste's new identity as territorial resident whose past activities had been resolved through official immunity and recognition of service to law enforcement that exceeded normal civilian cooperation through professional competence and tactical capabilities that territorial security required for protecting constitutional government against organized criminal conspiracy that federal authority was attempting to eliminate through systematic prosecution and prevention of future criminal organization. The ranch that had been defended through mutual cooperation became foundation for legitimate life together that could provide security and happiness without continued deception or fear of federal investigation, while their shared experience with life and death situations had created emotional bonds that transcended original circumstances and false identity through recognition that their feelings for each other had become genuine despite deceptive foundation that necessity rather than malicious intent had created for purposes that survival and personal happiness had justified, despite legal complications and potential consequences that honest relationship required them to address. The conversations that followed official resolution of legal complications included honest discussions about past experiences and future possibilities that had been impossible during period of deception and immediate danger. While Celeste's explanation of career motivation and professional experiences revealed character depth that exceeded anything her reputation as feared bounty hunter had suggested through focus on justice and protection of innocent people rather than simple financial gain or professional advancement that dangerous occupations typically provided for people whose motivations were less noble than circumstances had made necessary for survival in hostile environment. The domestic life that they began establishing included systematic adjustment to normal household routines that Celeste's professional background hadn't prepared her for, while her learning of conventional feminine skills was balanced by continued maintenance of tactical capabilities that their recent experience had proven essential for protection against threats that territorial isolation and her reputation might continue to attract despite official resolution of immediate criminal opposition and federal investigation that had created legal framework for their continued residence and marriage without fear of prosecution or forced separation. The community acceptance that gradually developed as neighbors learned about successful defense of their ranch was complicated by recognition of Celeste's true identity and reputation, While territorial residents' understanding of law enforcement challenges and appreciation for effective crime prevention created foundation for social integration that exceeded anything normal frontier community typically provided for former bounty hunters whose methods had challenged conventional approaches to territorial governance and citizen protection, but whose results had served community welfare despite techniques that peaceful society preferred to avoid. The economic development that their combined skills enabled included expansion of ranch operations and diversification into activities that could provide prosperity without requiring continued involvement in dangerous law enforcement activities. While Celeste's knowledge of territorial geography and criminal operations created opportunities for legitimate consultation services that could serve federal authorities and territorial development without personal exposure to violence and danger that her previous career had required for achieving professional success through systematic elimination of criminal threats to constitutional government and citizen safety. The happiness that they found together exceeded anything either had imagined possible when loneliness and professional necessity had motivated their original correspondence, while recognition that mutual deception had been transformed into honest partnership through shared danger and genuine affection, created foundation for marriage that could provide emotional fulfillment and practical cooperation for building future that served both individual needs and community welfare through legitimate activities and social integration that territorial development required for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework. The territorial appointment that was offered to Celeste as official law enforcement consultant represented recognition of her capabilities while providing legitimate framework for continued service to justice and community protection, while the position's requirement for occasional travel and dangerous assignments created tension between professional obligations and domestic happiness that marriage had provided through normal life, together without constant exposure to violence and criminal threats that her reputation and experience would continue to attract, despite official status and federal protection that legal immunity had established. The pregnancy that was discovered during their 4th month of marriage created joy that was complicated by practical considerations about safety and future security for family, whose welfare would be threatened by continued involvement in law enforcement activities that territorial position would require. While recognition that her professional skills and experience were valuable resources for territorial development created moral obligation to serve community welfare, despite personal preference for domestic tranquility and family security that normal frontier marriage typically provided without additional complications from professional background and reputation. The criminal organization that was reforming in response to territorial law enforcement success included elements whose patience with official intervention had been exhausted by systematic prosecution and prevention activities that federal cooperation had enabled. While their resources and international connections suggested threats that exceeded normal territorial capabilities for effective prevention or response without continued cooperation from individuals whose professional experience and tactical competence had been proven essential for successful elimination of systematic criminal conspiracy that challenged constitutional government and territorial development through violence and corruption. The decision that faced Celeste involved choosing between personal happiness and family security that domestic life provided and professional obligation to serve territorial law enforcement that could protect community welfare and constitutional government against threats that normal civilian resistance couldn't address without specialized training and experience that her background had provided through years of dangerous operations against criminal organizations, whose elimination required extraordinary measures and systematic approach that conventional law enforcement couldn't achieve through normal procedures. The support that Étienne provided for whatever choice she made demonstrated understanding and commitment that transcended personal preference in favor of recognition that her capabilities and experience created moral obligations that exceeded individual desires for domestic tranquility, While his willingness to accept risks and complications that her continued law enforcement service might create for family security revealed character depth and genuine love that marriage had developed through shared experiences and mutual dependence that had transformed convenience arrangement into authentic partnership worthy of whatever sacrifices their circumstances might require. The assignment that territorial authorities requested involved investigating criminal organization whose operations threatened federal authority and constitutional government throughout southwestern territories. While the intelligence that was available suggested systematic coordination between domestic criminals and foreign interests whose political objectives exceeded simple profit motivation into territory involving international conspiracy against American territorial development and democratic governance that required immediate investigation and systematic elimination through methods that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities and required specialized expertise that only her professional background could provide. The preparation that was necessary for successful completion of mission included coordination with federal authorities and international agencies whose cooperation was essential for addressing threats that exceeded territorial jurisdiction, while tactical planning that was required for penetrating criminal organization demanded utilization of her reputation and professional experience for gaining access to information and personnel that conventional investigation couldn't reach through normal procedures that democratic governance typically employed for law enforcement activities that served constitutional authority and citizen protection without requiring extraordinary measures or dangerous undercover operations. The risks that were involved in accepting assignment included personal danger that exceeded anything her previous operations had required, while potential consequences for family welfare and continued domestic happiness created emotional pressure that professional obligation and community service demanded she overcome through commitment to justice and territorial security that exceeded personal considerations and individual desires for normal life together without constant exposure to violence and criminal threats that her reputation and experience would continue to attract regardless of personal preference for domestic tranquility. The emotional conflict that was created by choosing between family security and professional obligation was resolved through recognition that criminal threats to territorial development would eventually affect all frontier families, including their own. While systematic elimination of organized crime was necessary for creating an environment where normal domestic life and family security could be maintained without constant vigilance and defensive preparation, that current criminal activity was making essential for survival rather than optional precaution that peaceful society could provide through effective law enforcement and constitutional government. The acceptance of final mission was motivated by understanding that successful completion could eliminate threats that were making normal family life impossible for territorial residents whose safety depended on effective law enforcement, that systematic criminal activity was challenging through violence and corruption that exceeded normal territorial capabilities for resistance or prevention without continued cooperation from individuals whose professional competence and tactical experience had been proven essential for protecting constitutional government and democratic institutions against domestic enemies whose power exceeded civilian authority. The infiltration of criminal organization required assuming identity that could withstand scrutiny from suspicious individuals whose survival depended on accurate assessment of potential threats. While Celeste's reputation provided credibility that made acceptance by criminal elements possible, despite their natural caution about new associates whose motivations might include law enforcement cooperation that could result in systematic prosecution and elimination of profitable illegal operations through federal investigation and territorial law enforcement activities that were threatening criminal control over regional economic and political development. The intelligence that was gathered through systematic observation and careful questioning revealed scope of criminal conspiracy that exceeded anything federal authorities had anticipated, involving coordination between territorial gangs and international smuggling operations whose political objectives included destabilization of American territorial governance, through systematic corruption and violence that could prevent successful incorporation of southwestern regions into constitutional framework that democratic institutions required for maintaining legitimate authority over frontier populations, whose cooperation was essential for territorial development and federal control. The tactical situation that developed as criminal organization prepared for major operation against federal facilities required immediate communication with law enforcement authorities while maintaining cover identity that discovery would result in immediate elimination by enemies whose methods included torture and systematic intimidation for extracting information about law enforcement activities and federal investigation that threatened criminal operations throughout territorial regions, where constitutional government was being challenged by organized violence and political corruption that exceeded normal civilian capabilities for effective resistance. The danger that was created by prolonged exposure to criminal organization was intensified by recognition that several members possessed knowledge of her true identity, despite careful maintenance of false persona. While their suspicion and systematic observation suggested that discovery was imminent and successful, extraction would require immediate action that could compromise mission objectives while ensuring personal survival and protection of intelligence that had been gathered through dangerous undercover operation that federal law enforcement required for preventing systematic assault on territorial governance and constitutional authority. The decision that confronted her involved choosing between completing mission objectives that could prevent major criminal operation against federal authority and ensuring personal survival that family welfare and domestic happiness required. While recognition that failure to provide warning about planned assault could result in catastrophic losses for federal law enforcement, created moral obligation that exceeded personal safety and individual concerns about consequences that discovery might create for immediate survival and future possibilities for continued life, with husband, whose support and understanding had made dangerous assignment possible despite personal preference for domestic security. The discovery of her true identity was accomplished through systematic investigation by criminal organization whose resources included corrupt officials and intelligence networks that exceeded anything federal authorities had anticipated, while the trap that was prepared for her elimination revealed coordination and planning that demonstrated criminal capabilities for counterintelligence operations that challenged federal law enforcement through methods that exceeded normal territorial capabilities for detecting and preventing undercover activities that threatened systematic criminal conspiracy against constitutional government and territorial development. The betrayal that revealed her position came from source within federal law enforcement, whose corruption had been purchased through arrangements that exceeded simple bribery into territory involving systematic compromise of territorial security and constitutional authority, while recognition that criminal organization possessed inside information about federal operations created immediate danger for all law enforcement personnel and civilian cooperators whose safety depended on operational security that systematic corruption was destroying through purchased access to classified intelligence and tactical planning. The escape that was accomplished under hostile fire required utilization of every tactical skill and survival technique that her professional experience had provided, while pursuit by criminal forces whose capabilities exceeded normal territorial threats created life and death situation that demanded immediate tactical decisions and systematic evasion through terrain that provided limited cover and few opportunities for defensive positions that could enable survival against numerically superior enemies whose determination to prevent her testimony exceeded normal criminal motivation into territory involving systematic elimination of witnesses. The running battle that developed during escape operation demonstrated both criminal capabilities and federal response that was coordinated through communication systems that corruption hadn't yet compromised. while tactical support that was provided by federal forces whose intervention had been triggered by emergency signals created opportunities for successful extraction, despite criminal efforts to prevent survival of witness whose testimony could expose international conspiracy and systematic corruption that threatened territorial governance and constitutional authority throughout southwestern regions, where democratic institutions required federal protection. The intelligence that was preserved through successful escape included evidence of planned assault on federal facilities and documentation of international conspiracy that exceeded anything previous investigation had uncovered, while information about systematic corruption within territorial law enforcement created foundation for federal investigation and prosecution that could eliminate criminal threats, while also purging law enforcement agencies of personnel whose loyalty had been purchased through arrangements that violated constitutional obligations and federal authority that territorial governance required for maintaining legitimate control over frontier populations. The federal operation that was launched in response to intelligence that Céleste had provided exceeded anything territorial law enforcement had previously undertaken, involving coordination between multiple agencies and military forces whose combined capabilities could address threats that exceeded normal civilian authority through systematic approach to eliminating organized crime and international conspiracy that was challenging constitutional government and territorial development through violence and corruption that required extraordinary measures for successful prevention and elimination of systematic criminal operations that threatened democratic institutions and federal authority. The arrests that were accomplished through coordinated federal action included territorial officials whose corruption had been documented through evidence that Céleste's undercover operation had provided, while simultaneous operations against criminal facilities and personnel prevented destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses whose testimony would be essential for successful prosecution of conspiracy that exceeded normal territorial crime into territory involving treason and international criminal activity that federal courts would address through systematic judicial proceedings designed to eliminate threats and establish precedents for protecting constitutional government. The trials that followed federal arrests established legal framework for addressing systematic corruption and international conspiracy while also providing official recognition of Céleste's contribution to territorial law enforcement that exceeded normal civilian cooperation through professional competence and personal sacrifice that had enabled federal success in eliminating criminal threats that challenged constitutional authority and democratic governance throughout southwestern territories where federal protection was essential for maintaining legitimate governmental control over frontier populations whose safety depended on effective law enforcement. The testimony that was provided during federal prosecution included detailed evidence of criminal operations and international conspiracy that exceeded anything previous territorial investigation had uncovered, while Céleste's professional knowledge and tactical experience provided foundation for understanding criminal methods and capabilities that federal prosecution required for achieving convictions and sentences that could eliminate systematic threats to territorial development and constitutional government through legal rather than violent means that democratic institutions provided for addressing domestic enemies and international conspiracy. The sentences that were imposed on convicted conspirators included death penalties for treason and life imprisonment for international criminal activity, while federal legislation that was enacted in response to territorial crisis created permanent framework for preventing future development of systematic corruption and organized crime that could threaten constitutional government and territorial security through violence and political manipulation that exceeded normal civilian capabilities for effective resistance and prevention without federal intervention and military support. The recognition that was provided through presidential commendation acknowledged Céleste's service to federal law enforcement while also establishing her legitimate status as territorial resident whose past activities had been resolved through official immunity and legal framework that enabled continued residence without fear of prosecution or federal investigation that could threaten family security and domestic happiness that marriage had provided through normal life, together without constant exposure to professional dangers and criminal threats that her reputation might continue to attract. The retirement from active law enforcement that was formalized through federal documentation provided foundation for domestic life and family security that pregnancy and approaching motherhood made essential for personal happiness and child welfare, while occasional consultation services that territorial authorities requested could provide continued contribution to community protection without personal exposure to violence and danger that systematic field operations had required throughout career that had served justice and territorial development despite methods that challenged conventional approaches to law enforcement. The ranch that had been defended through mutual cooperation became foundation for expanded operations that could provide economic security and community service through legitimate business activities that utilized their combined skills and experience for territorial development without requiring continued involvement in dangerous law enforcement operations that federal agencies could now accomplish through systematic investigation and prosecution that effective governance provided for protecting constitutional authority and citizen welfare against organized crime and systematic corruption. The community acceptance that had been achieved through successful defense and federal recognition created foundation for social integration that exceeded anything former bounty hunter typically received from frontier society, while their contribution to territorial security and criminal elimination had established reputation for community service that transcended professional background and provided basis for normal family life and civic participation that democratic institutions required for successful territorial development and incorporation into American constitutional framework. The happiness that they found together through honest partnership and mutual cooperation exceeded anything either had imagined possible when loneliness and professional necessity had motivated original deception, while recognition that their relationship had survived extraordinary circumstances and life-and-death situations created foundation for marriage that could provide emotional fulfillment and practical cooperation for building future that served both individual needs and community welfare through legitimate activities that contributed to territorial prosperity and constitutional government. 5 years after the morning when Étienne had stood on his porch waiting for a mail-order bride and discovered instead the most feared bounty hunter in the territory, their ranch had become a symbol of redemption and second chances that democratic society could provide when love conquered fear and honest partnership transcended deception and professional necessity. The children who played in gardens that had been created through honest work and community cooperation represented hope for future generations who would grow up in territories where law enforcement served justice rather than corruption. While the peace that surrounded their family life provided daily evidence that transformation and forgiveness were possible when people possessed commitment to principles that exceeded personal advantage. The school that had been established through their cooperation with territorial education authorities was graduating students whose understanding of law enforcement and community service had been shaped by Celeste's example of how professional competence could serve justice and territorial development when combined with moral commitment and personal sacrifice for community welfare. While the curriculum that included character education and civic responsibility could prevent future criminal development through addressing social conditions that created opportunities for organized crime and systematic corruption of democratic institutions that territorial governance required for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework. The Federal Law Enforcement Academy that had been created through congressional legislation included training programs that utilized their experience and knowledge for educating future agents whose effectiveness against organized crime would be enhanced through understanding of criminal methods and prevention techniques that their unique background had provided through years of dangerous operations and successful cooperation with federal authorities whose protection had enabled family security and domestic happiness that legitimate enterprise and community service could provide without constant exposure to violence and professional danger. The memorial that had been erected in territorial capital honored everyone who had contributed to eliminating organized crime and establishing federal protection for constitutional government throughout southwestern territories, while Celeste's name was included among federal law enforcement heroes whose sacrifice and professional competence had protected citizens' safety and territorial development against domestic enemies and international conspiracy that had threatened democratic institutions and constitutional authority through systematic violence and corruption that required extraordinary measures for successful elimination and prevention. The legacy that would endure for generations included legal precedents for federal intervention against organized crime, educational institutions that could prevent criminal development through character formation and community service, and family traditions that emphasized redemption and transformation as fundamental principles of democratic society that valued human potential over past mistakes while maintaining community safety through effective law enforcement and constitutional protection for everyone whose freedom depended on citizen cooperation with federal authorities, whose effectiveness required community support for maintaining legitimate government against domestic enemies whose power could threaten democratic institutions unless systematic resistance and legal prosecution eliminated criminal organizations through constitutional means that preserved democratic values while protecting territorial welfare and individual happiness. As sunset painted their valley in colors that reminded them daily of beauty that could be achieved through honest work and loving relationships, Étienne and Céleste understood that their story had become part of American legend about love transcending deception and professional necessity, transforming into community service that would inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort and justice over personal advantage in territories where freedom flourished because people had learned that true strength came not from weapons or reputation, but from hearts brave enough to trust and strong enough to protect what was right, while their children would grow up knowing that the most feared bounty hunter in the territory had become their mother, not through conquest, but through love that had conquered fear and transformed professional necessity into family happiness, that served as living proof that redemption was always possible when people possessed the courage to choose truth over deception and community welfare over individual advantage in America's magnificent territories, where second chances were as boundless as the prairie sky.